The Walking Dead has been a cultural phenomenon for over a decade now. With spin-offs being announced and the second half of the final season on its way, we wanted to look back at everyone's favorite zombie show. With 10 seasons of content, there is a lot to consider, but for this episode, we want to look at the bad guys. No, not the zombies. The actual humans in the show who kept us at the edge of our seats. Today we'll be ranking Walking Dead villains from bad to evil. For this video, we'll be breaking down some of our favorite antagonists from the first 10 seasons into two categories, the bad and the evil. With so many gray areas and like literally countless faction members on the show, there was no way we could fit everyone onto the list who ever did anything wrong or made things harder for our survivors. We'll be looking at characters who, at some point or another, were framed as a serious threat or obstacle for a significant amount of time, or whose crimes were particularly heinous. We'll also be including some entire factions on the list if the whole group works together to share a single role in the story. That doesn't mean that an individual member from that faction can't also make the list if their misdeeds really stood out. Finally, while we acknowledge the existence of redemption arcs in this show, we'll tell you now that they do only go so far. Characters who contributed a significant amount of harm before finding their conscience will not automatically have a free pass. With all that said, let's get right into it. First up, we have the bad. These are the characters who either redeemed their bad actions or had genuine reason to believe they were in the right. While we don't condone everything they did, we know it could be a lot worse. Starting off on a really light note, the gold medal of bad goes to G, aka Guillermo. If you've hung on through all these years, you may not remember one of the show's first and surprisingly wholesome villains, G. Way back in season 1, when the main enemy of the show was still the titular Walking Dead, G was presented as one of the first antagonists. He and his crew were trying to procure Rick's stash of weapons and were willing to kidnap Glenn to make a deal happen. He's set up as a dangerous arms dealer, doing anything he must to survive in this new post-apocalyptic world. So, who gets him to stand down? His grandmother.
This is not the place for you right now.
Then we learned the reason he needed the guns in the first place was because he and his crew were protecting the residents of the nursing home when everyone else had abandoned them. Needless to say, he's the best person on this list by far. Though he does endanger his crew and do a bit of kidnapping, he had very altruistic intentions the entire time. This was a heartwarming arc overall, but we felt the need to include him as a reminder of just how far the villain has come from those early days. Taking the silver medal of bad is Merle Dixon. We're lingering in season 1 for a while to talk about Daryl's older brother, Merle Dixon. Though he didn't get to have a full baddie arc until a little later in the show, he is presented early on as one of the most antagonistic survivors in the group. He was quick to put his own wants and needs first, knowing he could bully anyone who opposed him into line. He was also comfortable discriminating against someone based off of race, sex, or anything at all that rubbed him the wrong way. His aggression toward other members of the group led him to being handcuffed to the roof and left for dead early on in the show. Now, the fact that he was willing to cut off his own hand to escape showed us right off the bat that he was tough, while also hinting at his eventual return. Fortunately for the group, especially Rick, his return saw him in more of a henchman role than a leadership position. Still, he was mixed up in a lot of corruption with his new group. This included deception, violence, theft, and of course, murder. While he was also being manipulated by an even bigger bad guy in the town, we simply cannot condone his actions, nor attitude, in the town of Woodsbury. His brawling and bigotry get him off to a bumpy start and nearly cost Daryl his connection to the group on more than one occasion. But he dies doing what's right for his little brother, and that effort keeps him near the top of our list. The bronze medal of bad goes to the Highwaymen. We're taking a big skip now, all the way to season 9 to talk about our first villainous group, the Highwaymen. While not large enough to be considered an entire faction, this merry bunch of burglars banded together with the intention of doing crime in the new world. Mostly we're putting them on the villainous list for their cruel intentions and implied history of past robberies. They don't ever accomplish anything too heinous on the show, past, of course, sending a grammatically correct death threat. Still, when they learn that there are several groups of surviving humans that are assembling for a peaceful fair, their first thought is to steal from them, taking by force if they have to. The fact that they seemed totally unwilling to join a community or negotiate makes them seem a bit nefarious.
Well, how about this for an alternative solution?
They may be villains at first, but they're very endearing for a criminal enterprise. Especially when you consider that what finally brought them on board was the chance to see a movie again. Taking a pretty big leap into the bad, we present Lizzie Samuels. You may not have expected to see many children on this list, but Lizzie is a notable exception. She appeared back in season 4 alongside her sister Mika during a more peaceful time in the show's prison arc.
I'm not
afraid to kill.
Honestly, if it weren't for the trauma and undiagnosed mental disorders that were heavily implied in her character, she would be even lower on this list. We empathize with her for having to adapt to a zombie-riddled society so young and losing nearly all of her family in the first spot they thought was safe. Doubtless, that would do a number on any impressionable child. But while Mika seemed to get stronger and more empathetic, Lizzie aimed all her sympathies at the zombies. Not only did she endanger the life of the adults taking care of her multiple times by feeding and rescuing the undead she had named, but this streak evolved into active violence against others. In her attempt to teach Carol and Tyrese that zombies are just misunderstood people, she killed her sister. Had they not interrupted her, she also had plans to kill the baby Judith. Her actual crimes may have come from a place of childlike belief in the goodness of the dead, but let us not forget that she was torturing animals back in the prison before that. Obviously, we weren't rooting for her demise exactly, but neither was she mourned for long by audiences. Following her is Officer Dawn Lerner. Officer Lerner showed up in Season 5, and oh boy, do we wish she hadn't. She, for all intents and purposes, ran an abandoned hospital filled with largely captive survivors. Though we could have also talked about the officers serving under her, specifically Officer Gorman, who sexually harasses the young Beth, we feel Dawn had the most development, for better or worse. She cultivated a toxic environment for the hospital staff, patients, and anyone unfortunate enough to get trapped in her little world. There's just so much to unpack with her. Her people were separating and abducting survivors. Their hospital was staffed by largely indentured servants who had been taken there against their will. She looked the other way when her officers were hurting or harassing young women. But worse, she was hurting those women herself and the men.
I was the one who killed him, remember that?
She was doling out physical abuse as punishment for not meeting her insanely high standards of operation. While they tried to soften her up at the very end of her arc, we were in no way sorry to see Daryl bring her to justice. Moving deeper into the madness, we come now to the Saviors. It may come as a surprise to many of you to see the Saviors so high up on the list. They were the antagonists of the show for several seasons, giving them the longest running antagonist arc on the show. But the faction as a whole, we don't think is that bad. Many of the worst actions committed by the Saviors were really just committed by a few key members, and not to spoil anything, but you may be seeing some appearances from them later on. Their worst crime as a whole is complacency. We don't necessarily blame the individuals for wanting the protection offered by the capable psychopaths leading the group, especially when the alternative option was wandering the zombie-infested streets alone. All things considered, they also set up a decent society. While there's definitely some terrible stuff to be seen going on in the group, such as the zombie gate, harem, and the burning of faces, things ran smoothly at Sanctuary. They had protection, trade, and even a system of currency. Of course, that society only ran because they were extorting supplies from the other communities. That is the sort of selfish thinking that secures their position this low in the bad. The individuals may not have had much choice in the beginning, but when it became obvious that there were other communities where they might have been safe, staying became a morally questionable decision. Taking a penultimate position in the bad, we have the Whisperers. This was a tough ranking. The Whisperers serve as a major antagonist for nearly 2 seasons. We might call them more of a cult than a faction, actually. Oh, they may not have been a threat for as long as the Saviors, but they were a whole hell of a lot creepier. They believed that by wearing the skins of the dead and migrating with them, they could have protection in the new world. Their camps, diets, lifestyles, all equal parts morbid and primitive as a result. Obviously, there are a few key members who were extra terrible. But the interesting thing about the Whisperers as a whole is that we don't get to meet many of them outside either leaders or defectors, neither of whom are a great basis for the majority of members. Like the Saviors, people who join the Whisperers largely do so out of necessity, and unlike the Saviors, there isn't anything in their creed that actively pits them against other humans. For this reason, we almost put them above the Saviors. What made us lower their rank more toward the evil side, though, was just how violent most of them seem to be.
I do not have everything I want.
While their beliefs may not require violence against other humans, none of them show reluctance to kill anyone who crosses their leader or gets in their way. Their way of life desensitizes them to the suffering of other survivors and also rewards emotional detachment in general. Rounding out the bad tier is Shane Walsh. Right back to season 1. Although Rick's right-hand man in the opening season of the show started off as a fairly stand-up guy, he sank further and further into madness as time wore on. It was admirable what he did, protecting his comatose partner's wife and son during the beginning of the apocalypse. We don't deny that. Starting an affair with her, that was a little more dubious. But he did keep them alive, and they all had good enough reason to suspect that Rick was dead, so he can be forgiven a little bit. When Laurie blamed him for this, though, his actions got increasingly erratic. He used his relationship to Carl to stay in her life, even though she made it clear she didn't want him. He went as far as attempting to physically assault her when they were all in the base together, a crime that was never properly addressed by anyone in the group, especially Shane. His actions on Herschel's farm nearly got the entire group evicted more than once. Then he had the audacity to blame his disrespect of their host on Rick's leadership. Let us not forget that this struggle for power all happened after he'd already covered up how he sacrificed Otis to escape walkers. One of the most cowardly deeds in the entirety of the show. His clear jealousy of Rick, his position, his family, finally resulted in Shane's resolve to get his former friend out of the picture for good. Luckily, he's the one who didn't come out of the situation in one piece. Though he did do some good for the survivors, especially in the early weeks of the outbreak. Everything we saw him do on the show was to further his own objectives, and there was as much bad as good, to say the least. Now we move on to our second category, the evil. These are the characters who you wouldn't want to deal with, even if your other option was a horde of the undead. First up is Simon. This savior and right-hand man to Negan was truly a piece of work. If intentions were the only thing we were looking at for this list, we would undoubtedly have put him much more toward the evil section. It's never good when Negan has to be the voice of reason. But several times when these two were planning their attacks against the other factions, Simon was all for wiping out entire communities. It's only Negan and his insistence that people are a resource that keeps Simon in line. But even that only lasted so long. The second that Negan was out of the picture, or rather he thought Negan was out of the picture, Simon was ready to start mowing people down left and right.
Oh, and take the painting.
He had no interest in saving anyone nor building back all that they had lost. His only objectives were to make his own life easier and assert his power. Following up is another faction, the Wolves. These guys were built up a lot for the small amount of time we actually got to see them, but we weren't exactly asking for more. This is a group that, like the Saviors, is intent on causing pain and chaos, taking what they need and killing those who get in their way. Unlike the Saviors, they have very little semblance of society. Violence is the only way they know, and they don't seem too interested in changing anything about that. Falling just short of his own mettle, surprisingly, is Negan. Put down the barbed wire bat for a second and hear us out. Negan is, without a doubt, the most iconic villain over the show's expansive run. No one is here to argue how memorable, or, let's face it, cool he could be at times. Lucille? Epic. The leather jacket? Absolute classic bad guy attire. We got nearly a full season of build-up for a character who successfully lived up to the hype surrounding him. But we're not ranking how much we enjoyed watching villains, we're ranking how evil they are. And whether you loved or hated this, Seasons 9 and 10 went a long way toward humanizing Negan. We're not looking at the heartbreaking Season 10 finale, here's Negan. While it did make audiences empathize with his character, understanding a person's crimes is not the same thing as a full redemption arc. And we want to be very clear about this. Negan still hasn't completed his redemption. We have ample evidence to believe that he's changed for the better. He's done plenty of good deeds in Alexandria since his imprisonment, including turning himself back in after an ill-fated escape. He saved Judith's life during the storm. He saved Lydia from being beaten to death. He played a major role in ending the war with the Whisperers, even though his motives there may have not been entirely selfless. But even when you combine them, his good deeds do not outweigh all the evil that we've seen him do, let alone all the evil we didn't get to see, but know he must have done. It's especially not enough when you consider that he's still making plenty of mistakes and taking plenty of selfish actions along the way. He ran the Saviors for a long time. This included building and maintaining an entire extortion racket that leached off of several other communities. Aside from just the surface cost of the supplies, there was the mental anguish that came from being held under his iron grip. He ran through fear and violence, often making examples out of people and killing those who did not deserve it along the way.
It seems like you're trying to speak.
Things weren't so great for his own people either. Punishment, when it wasn't simply death, was having one's face seared with a hot iron. Captives were subjected to tortures such as prolonged isolation, starvation, and sleep deprivation. He even set up a harem of wives to help some of the more attractive women pay off the debts of their relatives. One final point in Negan's defense is that we do think he's changed. As we mentioned earlier, there's plenty of evidence to support the theory that he's finally on the right path now. A series of smaller, good actions that benefit society can, over time, be more powerful than one single heroic deed. The fact that this trajectory has already been established for him was enough to keep him from the most evil spots, but only barely. Taking the bronze medal of evil are the tied faction leaders, Alpha and Beta. This makes sense, right? The Whisperers were a bit more evil than the Saviors, so their leaders are just a bit more evil than Negan. Rather than choosing between Alpha and Beta, who eventually ascends to the position of Alpha instead, we decided to award the medal to both of them. They're just gonna have to split it. It's going to get a little confusing with no names, so just bear with us. Alpha, founder of the Whisperers, was also Lydia's mother. Before she was a crazy zombie-wearing death cult leader, she was also a terrible person. She killed her husband at the time, Frank, right in front of their daughter, whom she then proceeded to verbally and physically abuse. While she said that she did this in order to toughen her up, that's not really an excuse, is it? Then, of course, she founded the Whisperers. This gave her a whole new group of people to scare and, in some cases, literally whip into shape. Like the other faction leaders we've seen, she's technically saving them. There is safety in numbers, but she's not giving them a very high quality of life, and we all know that she's doing it for the power trip. She may have practiced what she preached when it came to toughening up with physical pain, but she was hypocritical in many other ways. She had no problem sacrificing random Whisperers, or their children, for her cause to get her daughter back, despite the fact that it's against her own rules to do so. She's eventually killed by Negan, but this leaves room for her second in command, or Beta, to take her position as the new Alpha. This man doesn't get as much backstory nor development. While the previous Alpha was alive, he seemed loyal and subservient, even kneeling before her and doing her dirty work. Audiences thought for sure that he was in love with her. Maybe he was, but that did not stop him from sewing her face onto his mask when she died, and then leading the Whisperers into even bloodier battle. She earns the position with her active intent to harm, and he earns his with pure execution. Together they lead one of the scariest hordes ever to grace our televisions, and we were all too happy to see their end coming. Taking the silver medal of evil is Terminus. Specifically, we're looking at Gareth, the leader, but the entire faction goes to hell pretty quickly. Terminus was supposed to be a safe haven that was being advertised throughout the show's 4th season. As was par for the course at that point in the show, the antagonists didn't have long arcs nor developed backstories, so there's not much to say about the individuals of the group. What we do know, and what earns them the prestigious Silver Medal of Evil, is what they're capable of as a unit. Apparently, Terminus was once a real safe haven intended to bring survivors together, much like the communities we see in the later seasons. When they were raided, however, it was honestly appalling how quickly their message of good turned into one of self-preservation. We sympathize with the trauma that they went through. We really do. Survivors of the raid were beaten, starved, and it was implied that a few survived some pretty violent assaults. That's no excuse for what they turned into, though. With the groundwork already in place to welcome people into their little town, they found a new method of survival. One that involved killing and eating the people they tricked into laying down the arms and joining them at the gate. Prisoners would be subdued, held en masse in large shipping containers, and then herded toward their slaughter like cattle. If you've seen the episodes in question, you know that we're not being hyperbolic. While the Whisperers were into some shady dealings, they never resorted to cannibalism. And as far as we can tell, Terminus got there within the first couple of years of the outbreak. Terminus was foreshadowed more than we ever got to see them on screen, but that doesn't mean they didn't have a huge impact. In fact, we think that they're a perfect example of the dangers of living in a crumbling and corrupt society. But still, there is one more evil than even our human flesh eaters. Taking the gold medal of evil is the Governor. Although Negan may have had the most extreme moments of violence on the show, no one was a better metaphor for all the evils of humanity than the Governor. The town he governs, Woodsbury, was one of the first properly functioning societies that is set up after the Walkers come into the picture. Unlike Rick's small band of misfits at the time, they had a whole town sectioned off and carefully guarded. Schools were operating, business was running as usual, and there was even enough excess to have parties on a fairly regular basis. The town had all the comforts of life before. In comparison to everything else we'd seen of the world, it seemed like a little slice of paradise. So how did Woodsbury manage it? Well, the Governor was killing and stealing from all the other survivors that his scouts came across. Innocent people were being slaughtered for their food, guns, or, just to eliminate competition. Greed is a recurring evil of the show, but the Governor wasn't even hoarding for survival. He was hoarding for excess and to protect his image. Even the people closest to him were not safe from his lying and deceiving. He goes out of his way to make sure Merle stays loyal while absolutely refusing to keep his promise of helping locate Daryl. He's happy to take in Michonne and Andrea when he thinks they have something to offer him, and just as quick to see them killed when they no longer fit into his grand plan. This is particularly appalling with Andrea, who was his lover at the time. The governor did have a brief chance at redemption after the collapse of Woodsbury. Without people to govern, he did his best to lie low and build something quiet for himself. But of course, it didn't take long for his pride to get the best of him once more. Then the cycle of lying, murdering, and grasping at power started until he launched a full-on war against Rick at the prison. All the deaths of this battle are the direct fault of the governor. But we were especially appalled by how he killed Herschel, one of the world's last medical professionals. The needless fight brought down what should have been one of the safest buildings left for the survivors. It also reinforced one of the show's darkest recurring questions of whether or not humans have what it takes to work together for our joint survival. Well, that's been it. Our ranking of Walking Dead villains ranked from bad to evil. Which of them gave you nightmares? Was there anyone we missed that you think deserved a slot? Let us know in the comments down below, as well as other topics you'd like to see us cover. While you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, stay wicked